So this will be notes 2 for this last unit. You can see you should use this on questions 17 through 26, and that'll be due April 30th before midnight, which is Thursday. So get that done. Now, Reagan leaves the presidency in 1988, well, early 89, pretty popular, and so it made sense that his vice president, who was Bush the first, George H.W. Herbert Walker Bush, is going to step in, but he also made sense to be president for a lot of really good reasons. The Constitution only specifies 3 criteria for what it actually takes to be president. You got to be at least 35 years old. You got to be a natural born citizen. That's what the words say. Most people have said that means you need to have been born on U.S. soil. Other people might say, well, that just means you need to be a citizen upon birth. We haven't totally figured that out yet, but that's the other one. And then the third one is you have to have lived in the U.S. for at least 14 years. So 14 out of your 35 years have to be in the United States. Other than that, there's nothing that says, hey, you need to have been in the government, you need to have military experience. Now, those all help. And so when you go down the line of like the criteria that most presidents have had, or what people look at to say, hey, he might be qualified. Bush is a really good example of what they look for. Powerful family, right? Family involved in politics. Go to an Ivy League school, so Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Dartmouth, Brown. I'm sure I'm forgetting some, but those, okay, have some military experience, although that trend has been going down. Our last, he's actually, Bush #1 here, he's the last one to have actually seen combat. Clinton did not, although he had some, I think, National Guard experience. Bush #2 does not. He's had some National Guard experience. His record is cloudy. And then Obama and Trump have not had any. Okay, but also have some money, right? If you're a good businessman, I guess that resonates with some people for sure. But most presidents have also had money and been rich and successful in that area of their life. Okay, some other government job, maybe you've already served in some bureaucratic thing, or maybe you've already been a senator as well. Okay, and then maybe be vice president. Okay, now there's been plenty who have made the leap from not being, like, they have not needed to be a vice president to be president. But if you add all these together, wow, Bush is like the perfect criteria. Okay, so get a few of those down for the study guide. All right, so it made sense that he would also step in right after Reagan, especially because Reagan left fairly popular, and it just made sense that he would take the mantle from him in the Republican Party and hopefully win the presidency in '88, and he does. Okay, now we said that really the Cold War is going to end within a year of Bush taking office. So there he is up there talking to Mikhail Gorbachev. Here's the Berlin Wall getting down. You know, once the Cold War ended, the wall started getting chopped down. So we kind of have a question on our hands, right? What do we do? You know, we had lived under this Cold War, us versus communism, us versus the USSR as the only superpowers for 45 years. Now that they're out of the picture, do we see it as an opportunity, right? Like, do we jump on it and say, hey, they're clearing out of Eastern Europe. Let's jump in there and set up our trade agreements, set up our, military establishments, spread democracy and do all the things that we had been doing during the Cold War, but now our enemy's out of the way? Or do we say, hey, we can now back off, right? We don't have to believe in the domino theory. We don't see communism spreading as a threat. It's been proved to not work. Do we back off? Do we lower our military spending? Do we do those things and kind of just chill, focus on internal stuff within the United States? It's a tricky question. And I think Bush mostly tries to do both in a way, and it really won't work, It was kind of like one or the other, but when he tried to do both, like, everybody had a reason to be unhappy, unfortunately. We're going to be opportunistic, and we're not really going to, just let our influence in the world go away, but we also do want to bring troops home because Americans have been pushing for that forever. So one thing people assumed we would do, going back to our first set of notes with Reagan, is that $1.5 trillion that we had been spending on military stuff, we thought, well, we would definitely lower that, to make a more balanced budget. I mean, people didn't want to raise taxes, and sometimes it's hard to really win an election when you're telling people you're going to raise taxes, depending on who your voting base is, right? And so people said, well, the military budget will probably go down. And it doesn't. Republicans don't want to do it. Bush doesn't want to do it. Okay. I don't know if it's because we still feel vulnerable, whether we're still thinking in Cold War terms, or whether it's that we want to be a little bit opportunistic and the military is the number one way to do that. But we do not lower our military budget at the end of the Cold War, which surprised and even angered a lot of Americans. Many were fine with it, but some just figured, well, what are we doing? I thought this was time for relief. I thought this was when we could relax. And if we're keeping our military beefed up, I'm not going to relax. I'm freaked out still. All right. So I think what their thinking was, and what Bush's thinking was, is that we can still fight for democracy. And in his defense, as the Soviets get out of all that territory that they had been influencing or had flat out just had totalitarian control over in both Asia and Eastern Europe, just because they leave doesn't mean that it's going to be peaceful necessarily, right? You're going to have border conflicts, you're going to have ethnic conflicts. Who is now in charge, right? There's what they call a power vacuum. When one powerful regime leaves, who takes the mantle? And we still feel like, well, we can't just trade one dictatorship for another, or if we are going to get oil or other resources that we would like to have in the Middle East or Eastern Europe, then we need people in power that are going to be able to hook us up, right? And be friends. And, democracy is the best way to do that still. So the Cold War ends, but we didn't necessarily change our Cold War thinking a whole lot. All right, so we're still this is the opportunistic part. Okay, that being said, we still have a reputation to maintain, and so Iraq is going to be a tricky thing. So here is Saddam Hussein, right? He is the president, quote unquote, of Iraq, but he's very much their dictator. Okay, now here he is meet with Donald Rumsfeld, who was, I forget exactly, was he Secretary of Defense? Maybe something in the Pentagon. But really, once Iran had their revolution in 1979 and took all those American hostages out of the embassy, we really worked with Saddam Hussein against Iran. They were a good area to station, possible military, you know, intervention with them, and we also gave Saddam Hussein a lot of weapons to protect himself, okay, and others, and I mean from Iran as well. So we gave him chemical and biological weapons, not nukes, but other missiles and other stuff like that. Here's the thing. Instead of just having those and using those only for possible defense, from attacks from either the Soviets or the Iranians or whoever, he takes those weapons we gave him and he ends up gassing his own people. Now, it was an ethnic group called the Kurds, Kurds, which is one of the biggest ethnic groups in the world that does not have their own country. Now, they live within Iraq and within a lot of other countries too. He would not consider them to be his own people. Like, they're not ethnically pure enough. So it's kind of a genocidal move. And we're like, dude, first of all, that's not okay. And second of all, it's really not okay to use the weapons we gave you to do that. All right. So, should we have ever given him weapons? No, of course not. However, it's also the Cold War, right? Again, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. If Saddam tells us, hey, I don't like Iran, you don't like Iran, I don't like the Soviet Union, you don't like the Soviet Union, that by default makes us friends. Okay? It only comes back to bite us later on. So we cut him off, rightfully so, right? And not only we cut him off with the weapons, we also cut him off with money. And we put economic sanctions on Iraq like crazy. And we quit buying oil from them. And it essentially bankrupts Iraq, right? Like, they don't have the resources or the infrastructure to deal with those kind of penalties that our big old economy put on them. So he's desperate for money. Now there's this tiny little country next to Iraq between them and the Persian Gulf that called Kuwait that has a ton of oil. And Saddam's like, hey, I can bully little Kuwait, right? I don't need your weapons. I'll just go take oil and get money and resources from other Middle Eastern countries. Here's the thing. Who else does Kuwait sell oil to? Us. And so we're kind of like, yep, nah, not okay. We're not going to do that either. Okay, so this is what the first Iraq war is. This is our mission right here. We are going in to protect Kuwait and also our oil interests. Okay, by saying we're going to protect Kuwait, and we are, it's not that it's not sincere or genuine, okay, but this is always a defensive slash protection oriented mission. Look at this. This does not say we're going to take out Saddam Hussein. This does not say we're going to take down Iraq. This does not say we're going to do anything with Iran. This is just we're going to protect Kuwait. All right. So here's the map we're talking about, right? Here's Iran. Here's Iraq. Here's Kuwait. All right. Small little country. All these gray blotches on here are big old oil fields. Kuwait's got a lot, and they have direct access to the Persian Gulf, which also has a lot. Okay. We actually asked the United Nations, you can see down here, if that thing will quit blocking it. We still want to go under the, flag or the banner of the United Nations saying this is a humanitarian effort, this is a peacekeeping mission, this is a protective measure. Okay. And so the UN says, yeah, we agree, you can do this. Okay. And we're also going to have help, right? We also, have other Middle Eastern countries, other European ones, Britain is going to help us. They're going to fly some planes and things as well. Okay. This is a pretty short war, right? So Operation Desert Storm is the technical term. Some people just call it the first Iraq War because, again, we have the second one after September 11th. Okay. But this is really the first big military conflict. I say big, it's not huge, but it's the first major one since Vietnam ended in 1973. It had been about 18 years, right? Now, what lessons did we learn from Vietnam is the question. Well, the biggest one is control the airwaves.
Operation Desert Storm had begun. British RAF pilots in low-flying Tornado aircraft carried bombs designed to crater Iraqi runways. The Americans' first target was Iraq's capital. From the rooftops of Baghdad, 3,000 anti-aircraft guns fired into the night.
Flying straight into this wall of fire were 8 American bombers. They were so sophisticated that the Saudis had nicknamed them Ghosts.
The F-117 stealth bomber was designed to be invisible to radar. But this was its first test in major combat.
The stealth's first target was the main communications tower in Baghdad.
At exactly 3 a.m., the pilot in the lead aircraft pushed the button and a 2,000-pound laser-guided bomb descended on its target. Across the city, the ground shook as 14 more bombs from other stealths hit their targets. The aircraft turned for home.
This is basically the only type of footage that the government would let get on the news, right? It's no blood and guts in the street. It's no chaotic Vietnam stuff. It's no soldier interviews from the jungles telling them how terrible it is to be in Vietnam. It is, hey, remember that 1.5 trillion we spent throughout the 80s on military? Look at what it gave us. It gave us these sweet stealth bombers. It gave us missiles, that we can blow up a sheep from, 4 countries away, because they're that accurate. This was much more of a thing that Americans could watch and be like, that is awesome, USA, USA. Okay, it's a direct lesson from Vietnam, right? control the message, make things patriotic, allow Americans to support the conflict. Okay, you can't support blood and guts. But this not only defended where that money was spent, but how awesome our military now is. Okay, and so these airstrikes made sense, also tactically as well. Less troops on the ground, same thing. Let's go back to World War II in Japan, right? We bombed the living crap out of Japan and then dropped 2 nukes on them for the sake of not having to hopefully put a ton of soldiers on the ground. Same thing with Iraq. Let's use that 1.5 trillion and the technology it gave us and not have to do the manpower thing, okay? Which again, after Vietnam, Americans didn't want another draft, and that's what they were afraid of with this too. So that limits our troops, so it made sense. Okay, now here's the problem. When you carpet bomb oil fields, yeah, that's kind of the result. So there is a ton of environmental damage. That is one piece of criticism about the Iraq War. The other one is, well, all that bombing, and like that video said, we as in the United States are the ones targeting Baghdad, the capital and the biggest city. The good news is we only lose about 300 troops in all this because we don't have a ton on the ground. The bad news is there's a lot of Iraqi deaths, okay? And a lot of them are civilians because, again, you're bombing the capital. So I know that video made it look like, oh, those missiles and those bombs are so dang accurate. You're only hitting these military targets and these radar towers and all these things. Yeah, but we also bombed a lot of other places as well, just within that city. Because, as far as war goes, the nastier it is, sometimes you hope the sooner that they will come to the negotiating table and they will surrender. Okay, but this is the other piece of criticism right here. Okay, it's not even close as far as what happened. Okay, and so it's that age-old question again that we had been asking since World War II. Do you punish the citizens for the crimes of their government or their leaders? Is everything fair game? What's okay to bomb? What's not okay to bomb? It is tricky, and we're still dealing with those issues today. It certainly was not just a World War II problem, okay? But the rest of the world's watching this as well, okay? Especially Osama bin Laden, okay, in the Middle East too, all right? But more on that later this unit. So, hey, at home, right? That pretty much ends the Iraq War. We don't take down Saddam Hussein. He stays in power, but we protect Kuwait, put him in his place, right? That was never the mission to go take him down. Now, some people never got that message, and that'll be something that people can point at Bush and say, you didn't finish the job. And that's why some people said, well, we would go into Iraq again in 2003. It was his son trying to finish what his dad started. I don't know if I buy that. It's pretty convenient, but that is what some people will say. Now, going back to Reaganomics from the last unit, all right? Eh, Again, as far as the money trickling down, by the late 80s, it wasn't. And like I said, the recession hits. Now, Reagan's out of the picture. Reagan is chilling at home. He's not a president. He's not really in the public eye as much anymore. When the recession hits, and I'm not saying it's directly because of Reaganomics, maybe it was just going to happen that way anyway, but Bush is the one that has to clean it up. All right. And so he's stuck between, you know, first of all, it's not really a Republican thing to want to help out poor people. It's just not. And the second thing is the budget is already so unbalanced because of that military spending and all the tax cuts that had happened that, if you want to raise taxes, well, that's not good, and the Republicans would never raise them on the rich. But you also can't really expand social programs and welfare and Medicaid and stuff like that because that just makes the balance of the budget that much worse, as far as Republicans say. So Bush is kind of stuck. Okay? He just kind of has to let the debt keep going, and people that are struggling and losing their jobs are hung out to dry a little bit. And one other thing that comes about as a byproduct of this recession is health insurance problems. When you get, so many people were getting health insurance through their job. Same thing today. But especially in the early 90s and late 80s, buying private insurance wasn't all that big of a thing either. And there certainly was no government option. Okay? A lot of states didn't even have government options either at that point. So you either bought health insurance from a health insurance company or you didn't have it, or you got it through your job. What happens when you get laid off from your job? because of this recession. So we had a ton of uninsured Americans, okay? Um, and also, government didn't want to step in because, again, it was costing too much, and also just health costs in general were going up. The thing is, it's great to get health insurance through your job, but how much that costs depends on the health of the workers at your company a little bit, right? Like the health insurance company is looking at it as a group. If you work with a bunch of unhealthy people, like that's going to drive costs up for you. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, okay? And a lot of people more and more are saying, hey, I will, if it means everybody's covered, I don't mind covering health insurance costs of other people. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that as a whole society of Americans, the more unhealthy we get, whether from smoking or the food we eat or just nutrition or obesity or cancer or whatever, the less healthy we are as a group of like 300 million Americans, the more insurance is going to cost because it costs more to take care of unhealthy people. Okay, and so maybe some of that's their fault, some of it's their not, but it's also partly the insurance company's fault because they're greedy, right? And the drug company's fault because they're greedy. So like this is all really complicated. But this is when it became on people's radar, early 90s. This is when you're going to start actually seeing the first calls, right, for the government to step in and do more for people's health insurance. Okay, now this is right after the fall of the Cold War. There's not many Americans calling for like socialized medicine yet. There's a few, but this is when that movement starts. And now here we are 30 years later, right? And you have a lot of Americans. It's not just Bernie Sanders. You have a lot of Americans and people saying, you know what? It'd be nice if we had Medicare for all. So that's when this starts. Now, there's reasons for it, there's reasons against it. But just like I said, we've been talking about green energy and stuff to get off oil since Carter in the 70s. We've been talking about health insurance problems for now 30 years since the early 90s. Okay, so some of these issues that we just haven't really been able to solve once and for all have been around for a while, is my point. Okay, so those things hurt Bush: the recession, the health insurance issues, and the other thing that hurt Bush, number one, was their choice of a vice president. This is Dan Quayle, and here are, you know, he got flack for just not really being all that smart. This is like a calculator, I think. Actually, it wasn't a calculator. What was it? I think it was some kind of piece of technology or computer calculator. And they're saying, listen, it's so easy to install, even our idiot vice president could do it. Pretty harsh. Okay? But this was so weird for Bush, who was like we said, going back to our first slide, maybe the most qualified, at least on paper, president we've had, to pick Dan Quayle, who was like the opposite of him in so many ways. Here's some quotes from Dan Quayle. Now, are these just like him misspeaking? Is this just him being nervous in front of a camera? Is this just him flat out not knowing what the heck he's talking about? I don't know. But I hope you all see the issue with some of these quotes. Okay. Anyway, so this is the other thing that he kind of got some flack for. All right. So last slide here. All right. Bush is going to be a one-term president. Now, we had this. His presidency makes 12 years of Republican presidents. And honestly, that's about as long as it usually goes before Americans flip-flop, where things go wrong, or the amount of things you can criticize leadership for catches up to them. Like, we switch back and forth between Democrats and Republicans, is my point. So after 12 years, it kind of made sense that people were looking elsewhere. And we just talked about some of the problems that Bush had. But the other problem that, Clinton or Bush is going to have is that Ross Perot, this billionaire Texan dude, who's kind of running as more of like a libertarian, but still on the right side of the spectrum, as in like on the Republican side of things. He's not a Republican, but he's got enough money to buy airtime. He gets on TV with these charts and really goes after Republicans about their budget balancing stuff and some of their economics. So he's like he's definitely more of a Republican than he is a Democrat, Ross Perot is, but he's also criticizing Republicans a lot. And so it's kind of their worst nightmare. Okay? Now, he doesn't really win any states, Perot doesn't, but he takes enough Republican votes away from Bush, and Clinton slides in and just cleans up on the Democratic side. And also, he really plays up like how young and hip he is. I know the saxophone. I don't know how cool the saxophone is in 2020, but it was for a presidential candidate to just get on Arsenio Hall show and go on MTV and play an instrument and actually talk to young people. That was pretty crazy and new for 1992, actually. And he just presented himself smartly as a younger, more with it version, okay, or I guess alternative, I should say, to Bush number one. All right, so get those questions done. All right, 17 through 26, and then we have two more sets of notes that we'll do. Okay, for this whole year, we got one on Clinton and then one on kind of Bush number two in September 11th here to wrap things up. So keep taking care of yourselves and get these questions done by the 30th.